On this day, the 30th of January, 1945, during the American liberation of the Philippines, a raid took place at Cabanatuan, Nueva Ecija, I hope I got that right, central Luzon, rescuing Allied prisoners of war and civilians from a Japanese prisoner of war camp. In 1941, on December 7th and 8th, the Japanese didn't just attack Pearl Harbor and Hawaii, but they attacked many targets across the world. They attacked Hong Kong, they attacked Malaya, they started the invasion of the Dutch East Indies. They began their attacks across Thailand towards Burma. At the very same time, they were attacking the Americans on the Philippines. At this point, a certain General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the American army on the Philippines. He was there to support the Filipino army. The Philippines at this point was due for independence in 1944, although they wouldn't get it until 1946. It was delayed for obvious reasons. And so he was attacked, and the Japanese began their invasion of the Philippines, along with half a dozen other places. By March 12th, 1942, it had become obvious that the Philippines was a lost cause. General MacArthur and some few select officers, on the orders of the President himself, were told to leave. They initially promised that they would come back with reinforcements, but let's be honest, they kind of knew that they were abandoning their men. They did come back, I suppose you could say, 3 years later, but I'm sure the men were expecting 3 months later or 3 weeks later rather than 3 years. However, 72,000 soldiers, Americans and Filipinos, finally surrendered to the Japanese on April 9th, 1942. So they did give them a good fight. We all know about the Battle for Bataan, the peninsula there, and the Battle of Corregidor, or Corregidor. Looks like corridor to me. But those battles were fierce, many died, and the Americans and the Filipinos fighting showed true grit and bravery. But it doesn't matter how much grit and bravery you have if you're completely surrounded, outgunned, and outmanned. They were pretty much starved into surrender, and then began their 60-mile march to the camps. So after their surrender, these 72,000 soldiers were force-marched across the island of Luzon. Many perished, something like only 52,000 prisoners, so about 10,000 American and just over 40,000 Filipinos, reached the camps. The Americans had it bad. The Filipinos had it even worse. The Japanese despised them and treated them as such. Along the way, people were tortured to death. They were killed if they fell over. They died of illnesses, and the Japanese did not care. Some of them just starved to death and fell over and died. So it was a brutal march. Estimates saying up to 20,000 could have died on that march. But if they thought things were going to get better when they got to the camps, well, not really. The Japanese had planned for only about 10 to 25,000 prisoners. They got 72,000 prisoners. What do you think happens when you stick 72,000 men in a place that's made for at most 25,000? You're going to get trouble. You're going to get illness. You're going to get starvation. And you're going to get Japanese soldiers, probably most of them quite young and patriotic and hating these people, overreacting to situations and using violence to impress their mates, see how hard I am. And so brutality would become a part of these camps. One other little problem was that the Japanese had not signed up to the Geneva Convention, so these prisoners didn't have the rights that prisoners had in Europe. So Americans, British, French that had been prisoners of the Germans were treated relatively well. There were instances of brutality, but overall, if you were a POW in Europe as a guest of the Germans, you probably didn't have the worst war. If you were a guest of the Japanese, well, we all know the stories. We've all met people who have relatives who've gone through this. It wasn't the most pleasant of experiences. The camp itself at Cabanatuan had previously been used as a training facility for the Filipino army. When the Japanese took over, they used it to house POWs. And there were about 3 camps in the area, and the camp was about 100 acres in size, so it was quite a size. At its peak, it held about 8,000 people, including some from Britain, Norway, and the Netherlands. I'm assuming they must have been the civilians that were there. I don't think there were very many British, Norwegian, or Dutch troops in the Philippines at the time. And throughout this time, the numbers started dropping because the Japanese were taking prisoners and forcing them into work. So they sent them to Manchuria, Taiwan, and around the Philippines. They used them as slaves, and as we saw at the bridge over the River Kwai, they'd work them happily to death. So because the Geneva Convention had not been ratified or signed by the Japanese, they could pretty much do whatever they wanted with them. As could be expected, their food intake wasn't very high. They got 2 meals a day, mostly of rice, which if you've only lived on rice as a student, you'll know it doesn't fill your belly. They would supplement this with various animals that wandered into the camp. Snakes, rats, and even the odd stray dog. I suppose if you're desperate, you'll eat anything. Also, locals would also smuggle food into the camp, as well as some anti-malaria medicine, I think antihistamine. So that was nice of them. And it prevented a massive outbreak of malaria amongst the inmates. They also managed to build secret radios so that they could keep in touch with what was going on in the war. They had also homemade cameras. They took pictures of the state of the camp so that they could show their living conditions. I suppose they were hoping and expecting to get out at some point. Now, in 1944, when the Americans had begun to retake the Philippines, the Japanese had sent out orders to kill all POWs in order to avoid them being rescued. At one place in Puerto Princesa on Palawan, they would round up the prisoners, pour petrol over them, and then set them alight. Yes, the Japanese were not known for their brutality for nothing. Because of this, and having heard about this massacre, the Americans were afraid that the POWs around Luzon would be killed. And so at this point, a plan was put into action to save the remaining POWs on Luzon. By January 1945, MacArthur's troops were headed towards Manila. They had begun the liberation of Luzon itself. At this point, an American called Robert Lapham, with a Filipino guerrilla leader, Captain Juan Pajota, came together and came to the Americans and told them where this camp was. They believed that they would have to rescue the people from the camp before the main army got there. And it was only about 30 miles away, or 40 miles away from Manila. But by this point, they could have all been killed. It was estimated that the Japanese had about 100 to 300 soldiers in the camp, and about 5,000 in Cabanatuan city itself. So they believed that if any rescue attempt was to be made, it would have to be made at the end of January. So at the end of January, the 6th Army leaders and Filipino guerrillas sent a small force to rescue the prisoners. There was about 100 rangers and scouts, about 200 Filipino guerrillas, and they were about 30 miles behind Japanese lines. So the Americans were making good progress. It was a nighttime raid, and the group surprised the Japanese. Hundreds of Japanese troops ended up killed. The attack lasted about 30 minutes, and the Americans and the Filipinos didn't suffer that many casualties. At this point, they went into the camp and said, "Hey, you're rescued." So by the next morning, they were escorting the POWs back to the American lines. This was quite a feat, considering that there were 5,000 Japanese just down the road. There was another 1,000 around that area in various bunkers and fortified areas. So they managed to get through, and it was also a farming area, so there's forests. You have to walk through the fields at some point. And they managed to do this right in front, among the Japanese troops. This would end up being something that even the President of the United States would recognize. MacArthur would award these men, the men who rescued these POWs, and they would be recognized by the President of the United States himself. The liberation of these POWs was something that the Americans were able to celebrate. It also allowed the prisoners to tell of the original Bataan Death March and the conditions within the prisons, the atrocities, the massacres, the extrajudicial killings. This caused fury in the United States when it came out. It was obviously used for propaganda purposes as well. That's what you do when you're at war. And at this point, the Japanese were not completely beat. They still occupied huge swathes of land. It wouldn't be until September when they officially surrendered. Even the Germans at this point had not been completely crushed. We were in the last part of the war, but in many ways, the last months of a war like this are in many ways the most dangerous times. This is when a lot of people die. This is what happened in Germany. It's what happened in the Japanese occupied areas. People have no food. There's no transports. There's no way to move things around. This is when people starve to death. It's when massacres happen because people are either they want to kill the people that they think are going to win, or they want to take revenge against the people who've just lost. So it was a very dangerous time. But this little escapade, this little adventure into the middle of Luzon gave heart to the Americans and was used for propaganda purposes. And the rescuers were awarded commendations by MacArthur and recognized by Franklin D. Roosevelt. So that was that. Now, a memorial sits on the site of the former camp, and from what I can see, not many people remember this episode, but it is definitely one that would make a great film. So if you like these videos, subscribe, like, and leave a comment, and come back tomorrow for more.